Our next speaker, Dr. Asma Jahangir.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me here. I also had the pleasure of meeting late John Humphrey and was struck by his commitment even at a very old age. I think that he was a person who did not really, to begin with, have resources, but did have commitment for human rights. And this is what we need to instill in the Human Rights Commission as well. It is time for reform. It is crucial and critical. I think that reforms should be carried out not only in the Human Rights Commission or in the human rights area of the United Nations, but in the entire of the United Nations itself. So the report of the High Panel on Threats, Challenges and Change, I think, comes at a time where we are asked as Special Rapporteur or part of the special procedures on the ground, what is the United Nations doing? How much respect does the United Nations pay to human rights? And there are questions about credibility of the United Nations itself. I think it is very important for us to recognize that and to address that perception or problem, whatever one may look at it. The Human Rights Commission, as I said earlier, is a part of the UN system. In the High Panel report, I agree with my speakers and I agree with what both of them said. It seems that human rights has been simply tagged along with the report. I'm not saying that it was not a colossal job for anyone to do, to carry out consultations, to put a report on the entire reform of the United Nations system. But it is a very important part of the United Nations. And I'm afraid, I don't want to use the word, but for a better word, the shabby treatment given to human rights by that report just shows how central or how important human rights is to the UN system itself, if that is any indication to go by. One has often asked oneself the question that does the Human Rights Commission work? Does the UN system work to protect human rights? And I've always come back with a mixed answer. Because it does work, not always, but it does. And I think we have to recognize that. For example, it has worked in the case of Darfur. Maybe slowly, but it surely has worked. Maybe it could not prevent, but it has been able to bring some form of justice, or will be bringing some form of justice. In Afghanistan, it did work. In my last mandate, which was on extrajudicial killings, I had the opportunity to visit places of conflict. And I can assure you that people there actually went, looked for the United Nations. For them, it was a savior. For them, it was an institution, an organization that in their very dire needs was the only institution in the world that they actually trusted. So I am not underestimating the usefulness, the integrity at times also of the United Nations, but much more is also expected. Much more is expected in terms of the failures, to look at what happened in Rwanda. Why did the UN fail to look at what was happening in Rwanda? Was it because there was no intention? Or was it because people were not alerted? And if you say that people were not alerted, then there is something wrong with the system that needs to be reformed, because my predecessor, who was a special rapporteur, Bakra NDI, had warned that genocide is round the corner, and he wrote it as explicitly as that in his report. Now, why was this voice of a person from a special procedure not transmitted in the UN system? And here I would take Professor Tube's argument that not only should the High Commissioner for Human Rights have access to the Security Council, but there has to be a focal point in the UN system which is looking at early warnings and which has very sharp ears, and ears that are accessible not only to special procedures, not only to treaty bodies, but all the arms and all the fingers and nails of the United Nations system. Because prevention, I think, is the first step where the United Nations must walk in. to once conflict has taken place, once violations have taken place, then walking in is far more difficult because we know the difficulties that we have in dealing with how to bring people to justice. We have seen the various tribunals. We are hopeful and we will continue to look at the International Criminal Court, and hopefully there are also recommendations of reform there as well, and I think that we should be able to strengthen the capacity of the International Criminal Court.